Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Association for Black Women's Historians TV. And I am humbled and honored today to be with such wonderful panelists to discuss Black subjectivities, state violence, and history. And this is going to be a really rich conversation. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, and I'm just going to have us dig in because we got a lot of ground to cover and not a whole lot of ground to cover it in. So I want to start, and I'm going to pose this question first to Dr. Holden, of asking, what do you think is missing from our current conversations about the archive of state violence against Black people?
A historian who works on certain forms of state violence against Black people, I think sometimes that our conversations about silence in that archive, which can be a kind of violence, have not completely come back to the ways that sometimes that silence actually is about strategy and is about finding ways to continue to evade particular kinds of violence. For example, I work on the Southampton Rebellion that a lot of historians call Nat Turner's Rebellion. And in his official confessions that are entered into the official record that are part of how he ends up executed, he names not a single person who had not already been tried. And with only a couple of exceptions, had not already been executed themselves. And looking at that, right, there's this kind of face value way of looking at how this kind of violence, this execution, this very public state-sanctioned violence is one of the few things that's recorded about his life. But the many gaps in the record that he constructs and chooses to use also outline a way in which some of the silences in this archive are really there by the design of people who are being oppressed by this kind of state violence. And I think that there is a question about strategy and evasion, about the ways that Black people maroon themselves all over the archive, and we have yet to discover them, right? So centuries later, they are still very successful at these strategies. It's something that historians across fields and time periods really do need to engage with.
Carter, you want to jump in here? How do you think about this when you hear about the question of the archive and state violence and how we talk about that contemporarily, but referencing this historical past of, I love this idea that Dr. Holden brought up of this kind of marooning, this intentionality around this in certain ways, but also this practice of erasure, silences, erasure, and navigating through that.
Yeah. I'm constantly sitting in class with my students, thinking about these dominant forms of violence that we're constantly contending with as Black people, while also reminding them, y'all ain't the first ones to decide not to tell somebody else your business, right? Especially when it comes to the state. And so what happens when we take that, especially like Dr. Holden, thank you, good looking out on that, because I absolutely agree with you regarding like how it is that we hold things, right? Black folk hold so much, in part because we can't trust so many institutions and organizations to help us, to assist us in forging the lives that we're actively trying to forge. Right. So many times I'm thinking about also the overlap between the, we'll say prison industrial complex, but also educational spaces and environments, right? We could be thinking about K through 12 and how it is that, just a few days ago, there was a story about a Black child who had the police called on them because they were on the Zoom call during class with a toy gun, a Nerf gun, right? So I'm constantly thinking about that collapsing between, the carceral state here being really represented through the prison, right? But I'm also thinking about how that is constantly being conflated with domestic spaces in Black homes. And this is something that critics and scholars have been talking about, especially Black feminist scholars. And I think specifically about Patrice Douglas's Black feminist theory for the dead and dying, right? That piece helping us think through the murder of Corinne Gaines and how Black women are selectively folded into, say, moments like the Women's March, right? But how the specific relationship between Black folks and state-sanctioned violence and Black women and femmes and state-sanctioned violence is not necessarily centered. And so there's an ongoing critique of these dominant logics of recognition around racialized and anti-Black violence. But there's also this other component, which is like, y'all, we stay here and we stay quiet, right? Because we are fashioning worlds. And we don't always talk about it in that way. We might say it in terms of, well, it's none of their business what I do in my home, right? And I'm always going to do what I want in my home, in my community. And so it's constantly balancing those two forces. And I'm often of the mind as an educator, I'm like, please don't just give us the one. If you're centering Black life, always help provide a language for how we survive. Right? And sometimes it looks like a willful refusal to participate in a larger project of archival inclusion.
Wow, I love that. I love that. This kind of lower frequencies or undetectable frequencies of movement and existence of life. And that made me think, actually, Dr. Johnson, of the conclusion of your new book, Wicked Flesh. And I'm thinking about the deeps that you conclude with, and the deeper, and thinking about that with regards to Black women and femmes and other gendered persons, Black gendered persons throughout this history. And I was wondering if you could take that into how we actually understand Black subjectivity in these contexts that are in tune with the deeps and the deeper. Yeah. Of this, and then using that in how we think about what actually constitutes anti-Black state violence.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny, like, as, and first of all, thank you guys for having me. I'm always excited to be in conversation with my comrades here. As Dr. Holden and Dr. Carter were speaking, I was thinking about silences, but also, what is sort of already on the surface, and what kept coming to mind was because that's the time period that I sort of live in, is the 1685 Code Noir, and the ways that historians talk about the Code Noir, which originally is named as a regulation to police the colony, the West, the Antilles, essentially. That's the actual name. It's a police document. It's not a Black code, as its first naming. And the ways that historians have talked about, particularly in the English-speaking context, the Code Noir is an ameliorative document, as a document that is meant to ease the experiences of enslaved people, that creates these boundaries that are placed on slave owners, that creates a mechanism, presumably a path towards emancipation, and so towards manumission, the Freedom Act, and the ways that, that's been seen as, in some ways, a kind of positive, and how tied to how that's not true. How in my work I try to situate that as false, and others have as well. So I'm not the only one. But the ways that we have sort of the ways we can think about state violence as endemic to the structure, as part of the laws that are made, as part of the policing of Black life from centuries earlier. And that part of that is very much the policing of what the meaning of manumission can be, what the meaning of freedom can be. Part of that is policing what the intimate lives of enslaved people can do for them, who they can engage with, who their kinfolk can be, who can claim them, who, as it was part of Sequitur Ventrum, who and how their intimate practices will be maligned or rendered illegal or punished for whatever reason, and the arbitrariness of those decisions being not in the hands of people of African descent, but in the hands of Europeans, colonial administrators, imperial officials, slave owners, ship captains, whoever else. And so thinking about not just like the ways that the law and the text and the institutions have sort of structured what violence can even be named as, but also the ways that part of that structure what has been really important, the part of that structure has been naming also who is woman, who is man, what are legitimate marriages, what is legitimate sex, reproductive sex is legitimate. Non-reproductive sex, not going to be punished, for rape. Will be punished if you have the child. And so these are things that I think these are centuries old conversations that I think sometimes when, as historians, we have a duty to kind of bring that long vision of state violence into the picture. But in the present, we also have to think about, okay, so how is this also manifesting? How is being shot by police somehow, somewhere related to reproductive justice and restrictions on reproductive rights? How is that somehow also related to the intimate violence that ends the lives of so many of our trans sisters of color? Like, those are the kinds of questions that have longer genealogies than just the 20th or 21st century.
What does it mean to think about anti-Black state violence as an evolving praxis, as technology, as is a reality and this kind of measure of citizenship or lack thereof, or inclusion in that? Because I do think we often say state violence, and I imagine that quite a few people have different takes on what that means, what that constitutes in any particular historical moment, in both the nation's history, but I'm thinking beyond the nation as well, because obviously we think about the state beyond this specific nation state as project. And I'm curious, in your own works and the eras that you're looking at, because across this group we have a rich kind of timeline of historical endeavor of what constitutes anti-Black state violence. When we say that, what are we encompassing? How does that figure into the work that you do in this moment and work that you see yourself engaged in as historians?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I've been thinking about a scandal for a number of years. And it's a scandal that took place in Washington, D.C., wherein a Dutchman who presented himself as an anthropologist, got in good with members of the Black elite in DC. He was friendly with members of the NAACP, a number of activists in New York, and also Black activists in New York and also in Los Angeles. And he said that he was going to do a study of Black school children, really demonstrating that the color line didn't need to exist because present in Black children were essentially blood from various ethnic groups. So he was making a claim about mixed raceness. For me, that case is particularly compelling, not just because of the violent actions of this particular man who uses so-called research as a way to get access to Black school children in Washington, D.C., bring them at times to the Smithsonian Institution, which to this day refuses to acknowledge any formal relationship between this Dutchman claiming to be a scientist and that institution. But I'm constantly thinking about how when the FBI investigated this man for essentially being a Dutch man who spoke German and hung around a bunch of Negroes during World War I, they refused, after having learned that this man was sexually assaulting Black girls, they refused to cast him as a deviant who needed to be punished for his crimes against Black girls. Instead, what they did was they tried to recruit Black people to become informants, right? So they recruited Black people to be informants to surveil Black girls and women in Washington, D.C. They also, at times, bringing Black girls to their offices to be questioned or interrogated, would talk about them as if they were always already sexually available Black women. And so a huge part of me unpacking that moment is thinking through not just how it is the state refuses to recognize Black girls as being girls who deserve a claim to innocence in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But I'm thinking about that as part of a constellation of forces wherein even members of the Black elite were so invested in a discourse of representation that they were incentivizing these girls to participate by saying, well, look, you can help the race look better. And so much of my concern around protecting Black folk, right, is also around the limits of representation as a governing logic for progressing the race, right, if that is to work. We also have to consider who it is that we're willing to ask and implore to put their bodies on the line so that all of us can live out the collective fantasy of Black progress. Right. And so in that example, I'm like, okay, we've got federal agents, we've got Black school teachers, we have a number of folks who are signing on as informants who refuse to recognize that these Black children deserve to be protected. Instead, they want to put them on the front lines of racial representation. And the FBI, they wanted to do that so that they can bait this Dutchman. They used Black girls so that they can set up a Dutchman who they couldn't prove was a spy. And I'm like, but under all of those discourses are these girls, right? Are these girls who are being forced to make decisions, not just about themselves, but also the race. But there are also these girls, like I was watching an earlier episode of ABWH TV. Ashley Farmer was talking about Queen Mother Audley Moore and her back and forth with the FBI during an interrogation. And it reminded me of this Black girl in my book. I write about her. Her name is Helen. I only refer to her as Helen, right? I want people to think about her given name. There's this moment in the fall of 1918 where the FBI brings her into an office. They want her to be an informant. And at this one pivotal point, she's going back and forth with this agent who has already had a hell of a time trying to find her because she keeps evading his particular mode of capture and apprehension for weeks that fall. When they finally sit to talk, she negotiates her participation. He wants her to be in a sting operation. She agrees. And she says, what I want you to do is I want you to cover my transportation. So you're going to pay for that. And I also want to get a white collar job. It matters that a teenage Black girl during World War I in Washington, D.C. was negotiating her social status, right? And also the possibility of a job with an FBI agent, right? And so I know that at the time, two of the most prestigious jobs a Black woman could have in D.C. would be white collar government worker, educator. Right. And so I'm thinking about how this Black girl, right, who to me is in a seemingly impossible situation, right, is still carving out a space for her to say, well, this is what I want. And I'm going to manipulate your expectations of me to get this thing that I want.
I'm going to jump in there, although I feel like I'm going to be coming from a whole other side of the time period. Because it, like even in Helen's sort of reimagining of what her world looks like, I feel like it speaks to how the 17th, 18th century can sort of speak to thinking about state violence, like how we can sort of shake ourselves loose of the 20th century structures that are so crucial to truncating Black life in this particular moment. The police, the prisons, the FBI, like all of this. One of the ways I'm thinking about state violence and trying to, in its most capacious way, define it is a move to remake the New World and excise Black life from it. And that has different looks in different time periods. And in my time period, it's literally trying to establish a new world in which people of African descent remain enslaved. The impossibility of it is mind-boggling, but a new world in which people of African descent remain enslaved, a new world in which the gender binary and range of sexualities can be policed and contained in particular ways, and where that move to containment both has a necessary arm of violence and range from the slave catcher, the militia, the soldier, the whipping post, the tribunal, all of that. So there's a necessary level of violence there. And there's also a kind of arbitrariness to it that is only applied to those marked or deemed Black. And so I'm trying to think of what is a project of thinking of state violence that crosses time and space, that appreciates the ways that this is a long running project and also appreciates the ways that there is an intention there, it's not Black people are criminal and therefore, they are punished. It's not Black people are bad and therefore that's why we can't get ahead, which I think is what, these politics of representation can get us into and get us locked into, we can reform it. We can't reform it because it's centuries old. There's no reforming it. The project is not the institution and the limits that it has, the limits that are placed on it or placing limits on the institution. The problem is that there is a way of thinking about living and being in the world that is antithetical to Black life, and somebody is trying to enforce that. And in our world, that somebody happens to be police officers, and many of them are white, but not necessarily all of them. And in our world, in an older world, that those somebodies happen to be slave owners. And I think the piece that kind of brings me around to Dr. Carter's research and the women that women and girls that Dr. Carter is working with, is that this world is the antithesis of this, the work of making a world that Black life can be so circumscribed and so violated and so violenced and all of these other things exists because Black people refuse to abide by that. They are determined to also make their own world. And that world is not a world of state violence. That is not a world of truncated reformed freedoms. That is a world in which freedom means something much more expansive, in which life means something much deeper than even humankind can abide. And, you know, I think that that's really important to name, you know, not just name the state violence side of things, which I think is literally like crucial to recognize and to think about concrete ways in different time periods that has manifested, but also like the violence is so extreme because our resistance is so extreme, because our determination to be free and to value life and to live vigorously and to survive and to not just survive, but to imagine a whole new world of being is so immense that it requires this kind of astronomical killing in the street.
I mean, and for that matter, I think about, you know, in the antebellum US, I study a time period where professional police forces are beginning to pop up in urban centers, Baltimore, New York, and thinking about kind of rural systems of surveillance and control. Antebellum white Virginians would have been very candid about the fact that, oh, no, we need this separate legal system for capital crimes on behalf of enslaved people. Yes, we have the system to reinforce hierarchies, that keeping the peace is synonymous with keeping racial, sexual, gender hierarchies in their proper place. And we must have full participation from the white male citizenry to make it happen, that there were no pulled punches or, oh no, we offer equality. Like that would not have been a piece of it. And the flip side, and the other side of the color line, enslaved and free Black people would have said, right. And so every day we live these moments of freedom, create these spaces of freedom. We evade you. We do actually have a whole verbal code because it's really easy to pick out when your patrol is going to happen. And so we just set up the alarm systems we have for that. Right. That there's expectation on both sides of that, well, we have this because we actually do need it to make sure these systems stay in place. It's not all posturing. And Black people go out anyway. They have church service anyway. They pass off cornmeal to someone who's passing through anyway. And so that kind of the persistence and pervasiveness of continual, not just resistance, but also evasion, survival.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I love this discussion from all of you about these different ways of world making that ask us to re-examine some of the ways that we've thought about this, to rethink even the framing of state violence that doesn't imagine the world-making possibilities that Black folks have consistently exercised, right, and imagined and brought forth. And that brings me to this question of when we go to the archive and in the ways that we've approached this, so thinking about this within the discipline itself and the interdisciplines that take this up, of how Black subjectivity seems to often be overdetermined and in our chronicling by state violence, and what that affords in terms of, one, right, just missing all of this resistance, evasion, tactics, world-making, imagination, but it also impedes seemingly at least our ability to grapple with what state violence does in the ways that we kind of retreat to it as a way to think wholly about Black life across time and space. And I was curious about how you all grapple with that as people deep in different kinds of archives that are working through Black subjectivity and what that even means, and resisting the penchant for reinscribing state violence as this over-determining factor and space of action that's always happening to Black folks.
There from the earliest period, because I think it's so funny, like the doing this work in the 18th century, this is the period in which all of these things are actually in flux. Thinking about what womanhood is going to be in by the mid 18th century, all of that's in flux. Thinking about Blackness, Africanness, all of these things are questions that are on the table in this time period. And yet this is the time period that often as historians, we approach with the most overdetermined sensibilities. Like if it's in the archive and it says this person is man, woman, you barely get sort of children acknowledged, like the acknowledgement of like a child's space in the French archive, like Negrite, Rapace. But even in those are rare instances. You will get, the various labels of negresse, mulâtres, these kind of like racial categories that shift across different empires. The Spanish have, the casta system. The French have, at the very least, 2 categories of Blackness that they decide to inscribe in documents. The English have basically often Black or white, not always even being gender differential. And so in this time, so you have this contradiction. You have this moment in the 18th century, across the 18th century, where the arc of these subjectivities are very much up for debate, being debated by slave owners themselves, by officials themselves in the documents, being debated and constructed and reconstructed and reconstituted by Africans in the Americas as they encounter new gender formations and new masculinities and womanhoods and ways of thinking about their own relationship to their context in the African continent or their birth in the Americas. And yet the archive doesn't give any of that. The archive gives us these categories that literally appear in census documents, and sometimes that census document is all we have. And so for those of us who are in the 18th century, I think we have not done historically as good a job as we need to in order to challenge gender binary, to challenge the overdetermined sexualities that we receive in the archive and the overdetermined violence of them placed upon Black people. We've not done enough. We've done in some ways somewhat better job of challenging and grappling with what Blackness means, what Africanness means, the way these categories flip and slide across the Atlantic. But we need to do more of that. A lot of the project in Wicked Flesh is trying to do that, to give a kind of arc and history of what Black womanhood is as it changes and shifts and slips and slides in relationship to empire, in relationship to slavery, and also in relationship to Africans' own relationship to their possibilities and their sense of themselves.
Say that. Okay. Yes. I'm fixated on stories. And when I think about stories, when I think about stories, Black stories in popular culture, I think about something that I heard Heidi Renee Lewis say, which was popular culture is about the stories we tell ourselves about who we believe the stories we tell ourselves about who we believe ourselves to be. And so oftentimes in my class, when we're thinking about pop cultural representation and we're thinking about narrative, I turn to searching for climax. Like Treva, Jessica, y'all wrote the hell out of that article. And one of the things that is constantly forcing me and my students to contend with is who it is that we're willing to flatten so that we can constantly reshape our political imaginations. That's being done left and right. It happens in terms of pop culture narratives. It also happens in terms of how it is that we engage with historical documents in various archives. And so I take very seriously the fact that the stories that we tell ourselves in the present are part of a broader archive. And so what does it mean to have an ethical comportment around who we tell ourselves we are, have been, and might become? Right. And so constantly, I'll say not constantly, increasingly, I'm asking myself how it is that form, in terms of how we construct our arguments, how we engage in writing, how form can be one of the things that undercuts, undermines, and helps us reshape how it is that we write about Black people. Like, I consider John Keene's annotations. Oh man, I hope I'm not butchering the title. I think it's annotations, but I think about what say experimenting with biography as form, right? How that looks. Because we constantly come across in archives these subjects who officially their biography is as long as a sentence, right? This was the case when Hartman was writing Dead Book, right? And she comes across a girl whose life, or a couple of girls whose lives were distilled down to a sentence in an archive. And so I begin to ask, as a scholar and an artist, I'm like, okay, so what does it mean then if, and bear with me, y'all, okay? What does it mean then if the stories that we have are replicated in the very forms that we take up to write and produce scholarship? And then if we recognize those very institutional conceits as a replication of the broader social and historical and political representations that we use when we make claims to citizenship in the face of state-sanctioned violence, then what in this very minor way, what might form or a rethinking of form allow us to entertain when it comes to centering Black life over and over and over?
Wow. Yes. I'm loving all of this, and I'm hating that I know our conversation is quickly coming to a close, but I wanted to pose a kind of last question, and I'd love for each of you to dive in just a little bit about it. And because we are thinking about these kind of continuities, the lack of continuities, and attempting not to do this kind of ahistorical grab back. This happened like this because this happened in 1792. Like, we don't want to do that, right? We're not sloppy historians over here. Or sloppy interdisciplinarians in the way that we approach this, particularly because these categories, as you said, are in flux, are being made, are being remade, binaries are being, put into place through processes of surveillance and policing and et cetera, that we take them for granted, even as we approach the archive and know better in terms of doing that with Black subjectivity. But I'm curious of, in this moment that we're in of Black life in 2020, are there particular historical moments that come to your mind as a way to begin to maybe process, grapple with, connect to what happened in those moments, to the convergence of things happening in Black life right now, right? Not to make a causal connection, but are there certain things in reaching back or moments that it would do us well as folks interested in the archive, in history, to look back at, to help us think through Black life in 2020?
Not being able to physically hug people, not being able to sit at times on a porch or on steps. It's all of these small things that we have been using to tend to ourselves. And in the midst of quarantine, right? In the midst of being on social media so much and taking in all of this news, right? Actively trying to forge community in the way that helps your flesh warm each day. That for me has been one of the biggest things, right? It's like, we'll have these larger news events. We know about the protests, right? We know about the violence. We study the violence. All of that is there. I miss frying fish for my friends, while also remembering Black folk keep surviving. We keep surviving. We keep surviving. And so I'm willing to keep reminding myself and others, if they'll let me, that we keep surviving.
I'm glad that you mentioned grief. Because I've been meditating on grief a lot, actually over the past couple of years, but particularly as grief intensifies, where the amount of excess death that Black people endure is ever present, at the same time that now that excess is an excess, that, folk who were battling with all sorts of ailments, are passing on. And then we have this other thing that's snatching whole cohort, whole friend groups at once. And I think about the denial of grief and the ways that has also been a weapon of the state, of hegemonic power. and the ways that endurance and survival and invasion have often necessitated African-descended people all over the diaspora building a new ritual and practice and spiritual practice to endure, right, the grief of even that denial of grief. I work on an area of Virginia called the South Side because it's south of the James River. And if you ever go to the South Side, it's very rural still. And there's actually a very visible Black landowner population in that part of Virginia. Many people who own land that their family had been enslaved on. But one thing that is very apparent on these little 2-lane highways that are often some of the same roads that were there in the antebellum period is that you will see little turnoffs and tiny cemeteries. And folk in the South Side of Virginia, they're not the only folks who do this, of course, but they tend their dead and they tend their dead themselves. Yes, there are churchyards, but people have their own place where their own ancestors' bones are. And some aunt in the family make sure the grass is cut, make sure it's tended to. And when I visited Southampton County last, and Cortland, the county seat, which was called Jerusalem in the 1830s, the Potter's Field, where most of the rebels remains after the Southampton Rebellion, where they are, is still there. And the local community believes it is haunted. And I'm not going to argue that fact. But that it is still this space of commemoration because it is also commemoration of grief that was denied an entire Black community. And Nat Turner's descendants have self-curated their own historic sites. They have self-curated the cave that they believe he hid in. On the land he was enslaved on, they put up their own sign, and it gets shot through, and then they put up another sign. And so I have been thinking a lot about the ways, we're talking about the state archive of violence, but the ways in which Black folk have always had our own archive, and have built our own archives and our own ways of remembering. And then when some of those ways of remembering are denied, we invent a new ways to remember. And some of the remembering is dissembling, and is holding, right? But some of it is also about finding the right moment to show the grandkids where that cave is. And I see myself, as a historian, as a part of that long tradition of holding, and assigning significance in the strategically appropriate moment. So I think a lot about that moment where I stood by Potter's Field, where these bones are still there, and could see where the gallows would have been, and could see the courthouse steps from that vantage point, today in the 21st century, and really could feel that being in a spot that is in many spots on many timelines at once. So I don't have a particular historical moment so much as the ways in which you can find this in many spaces where Black history has occurred, that you could stand in a spot and be both before and behind yourself in time, and finding ways to continue to curate that. And not in the kind of, imperial curation sort of way, but in more of a tending to and caring, as a verb, caring for, and tending to our dead in that way.
Thank you, Dr. Holden, Dr. Carter, for those, because it brings me to thinking about historical moments, but also historical practices, or practices that have been historically Black in some ways, and how important that is. I do have a historical moment, but it's a moment for me because of the practices that are situated around it and sutured to it. So in thinking about this particular moment that we're in, and very specific to, pandemic and protests and our sort of quarantine situation, but also the rabidness of police violence and white vigilante violence in particular, which is increasing every day. Important job of stewarding these moments of the past into some parallel with the present, so that we can always see, like, we have always been at this. We are always trying to create joy. That joy has always been seen as chaos by the police and by those in charge, by institutions in charge. And we will continue to find what ways we can to make spaces of safety, security, and autonomy for ourselves and our kin.
Well, thank you all for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. Drs. Carter, Holden, and Johnson. Be sure to list your wonderful books forthcoming and just out in our rolling credits. But thank you again for this conversation. Thank you for joining us for this episode of ABWH Television on Black Subjectivity, the Archive, History, and State Violence. Take care. Bye-bye.